In the stormy skies of Europe, between 1939 and 1943, a silent war was being waged. It was not merely a war of bombs and bullets, but a war of precision, technology, and desperate necessity. American bombers crossed the Atlantic with a promise etched into their metal fuselages, the promise of daytime precision bombing that would change the course of the war. But that promise was about to be tested in ways no one could have foreseen, and the initial results would be devastating, not only for the enemy but for the very airmen who risked their lives on each mission. When we think of World War II, we often picture the great battles, the famous generals, the strategic decisions that shaped entire continents. But there are smaller stories, technical stories, stories of engineering and innovation that rarely make it into popular history books. This is one of those stories. It's the story of how the United States, with all its industrial prowess and technological confidence, discovered that its bomber sites were fundamentally inadequate for the war they were fighting. And it's the story of how the British, working quietly in laboratories and workshops, had already developed the answer to a problem the Americans didn't yet know they had. Before we continue this journey through the skies of war, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment saying what time you are watching this documentary. Your participation helps us continue to bring you these fascinating and little-known stories from history. The story begins not in 1939, but decades earlier, when the first military aircraft began carrying bombs. In the early days of military aviation, bombing a target was little more than an exercise in guesswork. Pilots simply looked over the side of their biplanes and released their bombs, hoping that luck and gravity would do the rest. It was primitive, imprecise, and often ineffective. But it was all there was. The bombs fell where they fell, and the results were more often determined by luck than skill. During World War I, there were attempts to improve this situation. Rudimentary sights were developed, small devices that attempted to calculate where a bomb would fall based on the aircraft's altitude and estimated speed. But these devices were crude, relied on quick manual calculations made by bombers under extreme stress, and rarely produced satisfactory results. A bomber had to estimate its altitude, estimate its speed relative to the ground, mentally calculate the effect of the wind, and then release its bombs at what it hoped would be the correct moment. It was both art and science, and the error rate was astronomical. Between the wars, during that period of uneasy peace that lasted only 2 decades, military engineers around the world worked to improve these sights. In the United States, the Army Air Force, as it was then known, invested heavily in the development of more sophisticated bomber sights. The result was the Norden sight, a device that would become almost legendary in American mythology of World War II. The Norden sight was a marvel of mechanical engineering. It was complex, accurate under ideal conditions, and shrouded in so much secrecy that bombers had to take special oaths to protect it. There were stories of bombers being ordered to destroy their Norden sights before allowing them to fall into enemy hands. The Norden bomb sight operated through an elaborate system of gears, gyroscopes, and mechanical computers. It allowed a bomber to input data on altitude, airspeed, and wind conditions. Then, through its internal mechanisms, the bomb sight would calculate the exact moment to release the bombs. In theory, it was revolutionary. In tests over the clear deserts and calm skies of the American Southwest, the Norden bomb sight produced impressive results. Bombers in training could hit circles drawn on the ground with remarkable accuracy. There was even a popular saying, probably exaggerated, that a bomber using a Norden bomb sight could place a bomb inside a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet in the air. This alleged level of precision created an entire military doctrine. American strategists developed the concept of daytime precision strategic bombing. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of bombing entire cities at night, as the British were doing, the Americans would fly during the day, when they could see their targets, and use their superior sights to destroy specific factories, oil refineries, railway yards, and other critical industrial facilities. This, they argued, would be more efficient, more humane, and more effective in terms of ending Germany's war-making capacity. But there was a problem. In fact, there were many problems. The Norden sight had been developed and tested under conditions that bore little resemblance to what bombers would encounter over Europe in wartime. In the clear skies over the American desert, with all the time in the world to make calculations, without enemy fighters firing at you, without anti-aircraft artillery exploding around you, without the need to fly in tight formations for mutual protection, the Norden site worked wonderfully. But war is not a testing ground. War is chaos, extreme challenge, and conditions that change every second. When American bombers began their missions over Europe in 1942 and 1943, the reality of the situation became brutally clear. The first problem was fundamental. The Norden site was optical. It depended on the bomber actually being able to see the target through its telescopic sight. But over Europe, especially over Western and Central Europe, the skies were rarely clear. There were clouds, fog, smoke from previous battles, smoke screens deliberately created by the defenders. On many days, the bombers simply couldn't see their targets. And if you can't see your target, no matter how sophisticated your sight is, you're back to dropping bombs and hoping for the best. The second problem was actual combat. The Norden site required a long, steady approach period before releasing the bombs. The bomber had to fly straight and level for several minutes, allowing the site to stabilize and make its calculations. But flying straight and level over enemy territory, with Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters attacking and anti-aircraft artillery batteries exploding around them, was extremely dangerous. Pilots instinctively wanted to maneuver, evade, do anything but fly in a straight line while projectiles cut through the air around them. But maneuvering meant the site lost its calibration. The internal gyroscope, which was key to the site's accuracy, couldn't compensate for abrupt or sustained movements. The third problem was altitude. To protect themselves from lighter anti-aircraft artillery, American bombers frequently flew at altitudes of 25,000 feet or more. At these altitudes, the atmosphere is thin and cold. Temperatures inside an unheated B-17 or B-24 bomber could drop to 40 or 50 degrees below 0 Celsius. In these extreme temperatures, lubricants froze, metal parts contracted in unpredictable ways, and even the crew's breath created ice that could interfere with optical equipment. The Norden site, with its delicate mechanisms and precise optical lenses, often did not function properly under these conditions. The fourth problem was human. Operating a Norden searchlight required calm, concentration, and time. But bombers in combat were not calm. They were under extreme pressure, with adrenaline coursing through their veins, aware of the constant dangers around them. They had to input data into the site while the aircraft shook with nearby explosions, while facing high-risk situations, while watching other bombers in their formation being hit. Under these conditions, even well-trained bombers made mistakes. Numbers were entered incorrectly. Calculations were rushed. The site was activated too early or too late. And there was a fifth problem, perhaps the most insidious of all. American daytime bombing doctrine required bombers to fly in large formations for mutual protection. Hundreds of bombers would fly together, their combined machine guns creating an effective defensive zone against enemy fighters. But flying in tight formation meant that only the lead bomber actually used its Norden sight to aim. All the others simply dropped their bombs when they saw the leader drop his. So the accuracy of an entire formation depended on a single bomber, a single sight, a single human being doing everything right under the worst imaginable conditions. The results of these limitations were challenging for American strategic objectives. Post-mission bombing studies revealed that the vast majority of bombs dropped missed their intended targets by significant distances. Factories that should have been destroyed remained intact. Refineries continued operating. The German war machine, which should have been crippled by precision bombing, continued functioning. And the cost in lives was considerable. Bomber crews faced significant risks. Planes were lost on every mission, and those that managed to return often brought back damaged aircraft. The American commanders were in a difficult position. They had invested heavily, both in terms of resources and reputation, in the doctrine of daytime precision bombing. They had argued against the British approach of nighttime area bombing, calling it inaccurate and unnecessarily brutal. But now their own operations were proving to be almost as inaccurate, and far more costly in terms of lost crews. Something had to change. A solution had to be found. And, ironically, that solution would come not from America with all its industrial capacity, but from Great Britain, a nation that had been fighting alone for years and had learned hard lessons about aerial warfare. The British had arrived at strategic bombing by a different route. After attempting daytime bombing early in the war and suffering unacceptable losses to German fighters, the RAF had switched to night operations. Bombing at night offered protection from fighters, but created its own set of challenges. How do you find your target in the dark? How do you aim at something you can barely see? The British developed a variety of techniques, including the use of specialized target marker crews who would illuminate target areas with flares so that following bombers knew where to drop their payloads. But even with these techniques, accuracy left much to be desired. It was in this context of urgent operational need that British engineers began working on a fundamentally different type of bomber sight. They weren't trying to improve on the American optical approach. Instead, they were developing something entirely new, a gyroscopic sight that didn't rely on the bomber clearly seeing the target. The concept was elegant. Instead of using a telescopic sight to look directly at the target, the new British sight would use sophisticated gyroscopes to maintain a stable platform and continuously calculate the bomb's trajectory based on the aircraft's speed and movement. The development of this British gyroscopic sight was a remarkable feat of engineering. Gyroscopes were not new, but using multiple interconnected gyroscopes to create a stable bombing platform was revolutionary. The sight could compensate for aircraft movements, could function even when the target was partially obscured by clouds, and could maintain its accuracy even when the bomber had to maneuver to avoid enemy fire. It did not require the long periods of straight and level flight that the Norden sight demanded. Most importantly, the British gyroscopic sight incorporated a concept called continuous resolution. Instead of performing calculations only once before dropping the bombs, the sight was constantly recalculating, constantly adjusting for changing conditions. If the wind speed changed, the sight adjusted. If the aircraft slightly altered its altitude, the sight adjusted. It was a dynamic, not static system, and that made all the difference in the chaos of real combat. Developing this technology was not easy. British engineers worked under wartime conditions, often working through German air raids, with limited resources and under constant pressure to produce results. But they persevered, conducting tests, refining designs, improving with each iteration. And gradually, the British gyroscopic sight began to prove its worth in real operations. Bombers equipped with the new sights were achieving better accuracy, even at night, even through clouds, even under enemy fire. Meanwhile, in the United States, reports from European operations were creating growing alarm. Casualties were high, accuracy was low, and strategic objectives were not being met. There was initial resistance to admitting that the Norden sight, in which so much had been invested, was not up to the demands of real combat. National pride was at stake, professional reputations, enormous financial investments. But the reality of the mission reports could not be denied. Something had to change. It was in this context that one of the most important, yet least known, technological transfers of the Second World War began. American engineers and officers began to seriously study the British gyroscopic sight. Initially, there was skepticism. How could something developed by a lesser power have surpassed the genius of American engineering? But the numbers didn't lie. In direct tests under simulated combat conditions, the British gyroscopic sight consistently outperformed the Norden. The decision to adopt British technology was not taken lightly or quickly. There were compatibility issues. American bombers would have to be modified to accommodate the new sights. Crews would have to be retrained. There were production issues. How could America manufacture these sights in sufficient quantities? And there was the delicate issue of pride. How to explain to the American public and Congress that the secret, marvelous sight in which billions had been invested was not actually the best tool for the job. But military necessity outweighed all these concerns. Commanders in the field were desperate for anything that could improve the effectiveness of their missions and reduce high loss rates. By mid-1943, the decision was made. American air forces would begin adopting British gyroscopic technology. It wouldn't be an instantaneous transition. It would take months to modify aircraft, produce new sights in sufficient quantities, and train crews in their use. But the process was underway. The implementation of British gyroscopic technology on American bombers was a massive exercise in logistics and training. Thousands of sights had to be produced. American factories, working from British designs, began producing the complex gyroscopic assemblies. It was no simple task. The gyroscopes required extremely precise manufacturing tolerances. Components had to be balanced with micrometric precision. Any imperfection, any misalignment, and the sight would not function correctly. Bomber crews, many of whom had spent months training with the Norden sight, now had to learn a completely new system. The basic principles were similar, but the operational details were different. The gyroscopic sight required a different approach, a different understanding of how to use it effectively. Instructors were sent from Great Britain to assist with the training. Manuals were translated and adapted. And slowly, base by base, squadron by squadron, the American bomber fleet began the transition. The initial results were encouraging. Bombers equipped with the new gyroscopic sights reported improved accuracy under combat conditions. The ability to maintain accuracy even while maneuvering proved particularly valuable. Pilots no longer had to make those extremely dangerous long, straight flights. They could take evasive action and still deliver their bombs with reasonable accuracy. Crew survival rates began to improve. Not dramatically, because daytime bombing over heavily defended Europe would always be dangerous, but every incremental improvement meant lives saved. But perhaps the most significant impact of the British gyroscopic sight was how it changed the entire American approach to strategic bombing. With the improved ability to bomb precisely even under adverse conditions, mission planners could be more ambitious in their target choices. Factories that were previously considered too difficult to hit due to heavy defenses or location in areas with poor weather could now be targeted. The strategic bombing campaign became more effective, more flexible, and more able to adapt to changing conditions. It is important to note that even with British gyroscopic technology, precision bombing remained an immense challenge. Improved sights were not magic solutions. Bombs still missed targets. Crews still made mistakes. Weather conditions still interfered with operations. But the improvement was real and measurable. Post-war bombing effectiveness studies showed that missions conducted after the adoption of British gyroscopic technology had significantly higher hit rates than those conducted before. There is a profound irony in this story that should not be missed. The United States, with its vast industrial capacity, its almost unlimited resources, and its reliance on technological solutions, had to turn to Great Britain, a smaller nation struggling with scarce resources, for the technology that made its strategic bombing truly effective. It was not America that solved the problem of precision bombing. It was British engineers working in bombed-out laboratories with limited materials and under constant pressure who developed the revolutionary solution. This story also illustrates a broader principle about technological development and military innovation. Often, the best solutions don't come from the richest nations or the best-funded organizations. They come from those facing the most pressing problems, those forced by necessity to think creatively and work with what they have. Britain, fighting for survival, had to innovate or perish. The pressure of necessity bred creativity. The transition from optical sights to gyroscopic sights also represented a broader philosophical shift in how we think about targets and accuracy. The Norden sight represented an old approach. Aim directly at what you want to hit and drop your bomb at the right moment. It was intuitive, straightforward, and based on principles that anyone could understand. The British gyroscopic sight represented something more abstract. Trust the gyroscopes to calculate where your target is, even if you can't see it clearly. Trust the instruments to tell the truth about your position and movement. It was an approach that required faith in technology, in mathematics, in complex systems that no individual could fully comprehend. This shift from direct reliance on senses to reliance on instruments would foreshadow later developments in aerial warfare. Today, precision bombing is conducted using GPS, inertial guidance, sophisticated radar, and powerful computers. Pilots frequently drop weapons on targets they never see directly, relying entirely on their electronic systems. The British targeting gyroscopes were a crucial initial step in this journey from trusting our eyes to trusting our instruments. But there is another dimension to this story that deserves exploration: the human dimension. Behind every statistic about bombing accuracy, behind every technical report on targeting performance, there were real human beings. There were young men, mostly in their 20s, flying fragile planes over hostile enemy territory. There were bombers looking through their sights, fingers on launch buttons, knowing that their decisions would determine not only the success of the mission, but possibly their own lives and the lives of their crews. These men face challenges that are difficult for civilians to comprehend. Imagine being confined in a B-17 bomber, flying at 25,000 feet where the air is so thin you need supplemental oxygen to stay conscious. It's so cold your breath freezes instantly, creating ice crystals that form on your oxygen mask. You're wearing layers of clothing, yet you're still shivering uncontrollably. And then the anti-aircraft explosions begin. Black clouds of debris appear around you, each representing a significant danger. You feel the plane shake with nearby explosions. You see bombers around you being hit, facing serious difficulties. And in this extremely challenging environment, you are expected to focus on a complex bombing target, input data with precision, perform calculations, and release your bombs at the exact right moment. It's an extraordinary demand of human beings. That anyone could do this under such conditions is a testament to the training, courage, and dedication of these young aviators. That they weren't more successful with the inadequate technology they initially received is no surprise. The surprise is that they achieved some success at all. The improvements brought about by British gyroscopic technology made a difference not only in mission outcomes, but in the lives of these men. When a bomber could complete its mission more quickly, when it didn't have to make long, straight flights making itself an easy target, when it could maneuver while still maintaining accuracy, the chances of survival improved. Each percentage point improvement in survivability meant hundreds of lives saved throughout the bombing campaign. It is also important to remember that this story of technological development occurred in the context of a global conflict. While engineers were working on bomber sites, significant events were taking place on battlefields around the world. Cities were being affected by the conflict. The war in the Pacific was ongoing. The development of British gyroscopic technology, and its adoption by the Americans, was only a small part of a much larger conflict that was reshaping the world. But it was an important part. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe, despite all its controversies and significant costs, played a significant role in defeating Nazi Germany. By destroying industrial capacity, disrupting fuel production, and forcing the Germans to divert massive resources to air defense, the bombing contributed to the eventual collapse of the Nazi war machine. And the British gyroscopic site, making this bombing more effective, played its part in that victory. After the war, as historians and analysts began to assess the conflict, the history of bomber sites emerged as a fascinating case study in Allied cooperation, technology transfer, and the realities of combat versus peacetime expectations. Official reports documented how the transition from optical to gyroscopic sites improved the effectiveness of bombing operations. But these cold, technical reports captured only part of the story. They did not fully capture the human cost of the initial phase when inadequate sites cost so many lives, or the relief of the crews when better equipment finally arrived. The Norden site, despite its inadequacies under real combat conditions, remained shrouded in a certain myth in the post-war period. Popular books and films often portrayed it as a miraculous secret weapon. The reality was more complicated and more human. It was a good piece of engineering that was not up to the demands of its operational environment. There was no shame in that. Many military systems throughout history have proven inadequate when tested in real combat. What matters is how organizations respond when they discover these inadequacies. The American response, once the gravity of the problem was recognized, was pragmatic and effective. There was a willingness to learn from allies, to adopt foreign technology even if it meant admitting that the American approach was not superior. There was a willingness to make difficult and expensive changes in the midst of war. And there was a willingness to prioritize operational effectiveness and crew lives over organizational or national pride. These are not guaranteed answers. Many military organizations throughout history have persisted with flawed technologies due to institutional inertia, pride, or emotional investment in particular approaches. The British response also deserves recognition. Facing limited resources and immense pressure, British engineers developed a truly innovative solution. And then, in the spirit of alliance, they freely shared this technology with their American allies. There were no royalty demands, no control over how the technology would be used, just a willingness to share innovations that could help the common cause. This kind of genuine cooperation between allies was one of the strengths of the coalition that eventually defeated the Axis powers. Looking back from this 8-decade perspective, we can see this story of bomber sites as a microcosm of larger themes of World War II. We see the importance of technology and innovation. We see how even powerful nations have limitations and can benefit from learning from others. We see the significant challenges of the conflict and how every technical decision, every delay in implementing better solutions, had real human consequences. And we see how, in the end, it was the Allies' ability to share knowledge, learn from mistakes, and adapt quickly that helped secure victory. This story also reminds us that progress is rarely linear or simple. America didn't begin the war with inferior sites because Americans were less intelligent or less capable than the British. They started with a different approach, developed under different assumptions about how strategic bombing would be conducted. When that approach proved inadequate, there was the ability to adapt. This adaptability, this willingness to change when confronted with new evidence, is itself a crucial form of strength. For the generations that lived through World War II, stories like this were well known. Veterans remembered the differences between types of equipment, the transitions from old to new systems, and the ways in which technology evolved during the war. But as that generation passed, as the temporal distance increased, many of these technical details were lost from popular narratives. We are left with simplified stories that fail to capture the complexities, challenges, and remarkable engineering achievements of that period. That's why it's worth revisiting these stories today. They teach us lessons about innovation, about international cooperation, about the importance of testing systems under realistic conditions, about the need for humility even when you are a superpower. They remind us that great achievements often come from collaborative work, not from isolated geniuses or nations working alone. And they honor the memory of those who fought, the engineers who innovated, and the crews who flew dangerous missions with whatever equipment they were given. The history of bomber sites in World War II also raises questions that remain relevant today. How do we properly test military systems before using them in combat? How do we balance the need for secrecy with the need to share information with allies? How do we respond when we discover that equipment we have invested heavily in is not up to the task? How do we ensure that organizational or national pride does not interfere with effective decision-making? These are questions that militaries and governments still grapple with. In the broader field of technological history, the development of the British gyroscopic sight represents a pivotal moment. Gyroscopes had existed for decades, but using them in this particular way, to create a stable bombing platform that could compensate for aircraft movement and continuously calculate bomb trajectories, was groundbreaking. This technology would later influence the development of inertial navigation systems, stabilized weapon platforms, and eventually guidance systems for rockets and missiles. The principles developed for those World War II bombing sites would resonate through decades of subsequent technological development. It is also noteworthy that this story of American failure and adaptation did not significantly diminish the American role in the eventual victory. The United States brought immense resources to the war. Massive industrial capacity, a huge population, technological creativity, and a determination to win. A failed bomber site was a setback, not a fatal failure. The willingness and ability to correct the problem, learn from allies, and adapt quickly demonstrated the kinds of strengths that ultimately secured Allied victory. For Great Britain, the development of the gyroscopic sight was a point of pride, but not one they boasted about excessively. There was a war to win, and innovations were simply part of the struggle. The British mentality, shaped by years of solitary warfare before the Americans entered the conflict, was pragmatic. If you have something that works better, share it with your allies. Everyone was fighting the same enemy. Individual victories in innovation meant less than the shared ultimate victory over the forces of fascism. As we approach the end of this narrative, it's worth considering that every technological advancement in warfare has two sides. Better bomber sights meant more precise bombing, which meant better focus on military targets. In theory. In practice, even with improved technology, the strategic bombing of World War II had significant impacts beyond the intended military targets. Technology made bombing more effective, but it did not eliminate the ethical dilemmas inherent in aerial warfare. This moral tension is something that later generations have continued to reflect upon. How do we balance military needs with ethical principles? Technology can help increase accuracy, but it cannot completely eliminate the moral dilemmas of armed conflict. The gyroscopic sights of World War II were better than their predecessors, but they did not make war something without moral complexities. As we reflect on the story of the skies of war in mid-20th century Europe, we are reminded that behind every statistic, every technical report, every engineering breakthrough, there were real people. There were young bombardiers looking through scopes, trying to do their job under impossible conditions. There were engineers working nights in laboratories, trying to solve problems that meant life or death for aviators they would never know. There were commanders making difficult decisions about equipment, tactics, and when to persist versus when to change course. And there were also, of course, the people on the ground, those whose lives were affected by the bombing operations. Workers in industrial facilities who were considered legitimate military targets, but also human beings living in wartime. Families residing near areas of strategic interest. People whose fates were influenced by decisions made in airplanes thousands of feet above them. The history of war is always, fundamentally, a human story, no matter how technological it becomes. So what have we learned from this story? We've learned that even great powers have limitations. We've learned that true allies share not only burdens, but also knowledge and innovations. We've learned that the pressure of necessity can generate remarkable creativity. We've learned that adapting when confronted with evidence of failure is a form of strength, not weakness. And we've learned that behind every technological advancement are human beings doing the best they can under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The bombing sites of World War II, both the inadequate and the improved ones, are now museum artifacts. Technology has moved on. Today, bombing accuracy has reached levels that World War II crews would have found miraculous. But the principles those engineers of the 1940s were struggling to implement, the challenges they faced, and the solutions they developed remain instructive. They remind us that progress is possible even in the most difficult circumstances, that cooperation among allies can achieve what isolated efforts cannot, and that humility in the face of facts is always wise. May this story inspire us to approach modern challenges with the same determination, pragmatism, and willingness to learn and adapt that those engineers and aviators demonstrated 8 decades ago. May we remember their sacrifices and honor their memory by continuing to seek solutions to difficult problems, working with others toward common goals, and never allowing pride or inertia to prevent us from doing what is right and effective. Ultimately, the story of bomber sites in World War II is a story about people rising to the occasion to meet immense challenges. It's about failing, learning, and improving. It's about cooperation when it mattered most. It's about the intersection of technology and humanity in one of history's darkest periods. And it's a reminder that even in war, even when confronted with the worst expressions of human nature in fascism and totalitarianism, people can also demonstrate remarkable creativity, courage, and humanity. May we learn from their experiences. May we honor their memory. And may we strive to build a world where peace and cooperation prevail. This is a story from the past, but its lessons resonate in the present and will echo into the future. May the Lord God grant us wisdom to learn from history and strength to build a better future for all generations to come.